if you're developing a constitution for a country, you have to create rules that factor in the reality that there will be bad actors who will try to subvert the system. You don't get to choose who will be in your country, but you do get to choose who will be in your company. There's a principle in here around what are the assumptions that you want to be able to make about the people that you work with. One of our most important cultural values is treat people like adults. What does that phrase mean to you?
So in my opinion, it means don't try and sugarcoat. Treat people like they have the same intellectual capability that you do. And in general, be respectful. Inherent in treating people like adults also is act like an adult, which is sort of like a bidirectional responsibility.
Yeah, it's interesting. The first place I go is the trust part of what comes up with that. Managing people within an organization is sort of built around worst case scenarios. You know, you have an expense policy because you're afraid somebody's going to abuse the expense policy. And I have always thought of the treat people like adults as flipping that on its head. And let's assume, another phrase we use a lot, assume best intent, right? And assume that everybody is going to act like an adult and act responsibly and create policy around that, or center your policy on that, not the edge cases.
A lot of this comes down to assumptions. And specifically, what assumptions can you safely make about everyone else at the company? I'll give you a specific example, measuring development velocity for the engineering team. This is a notoriously difficult thing. And a lot of, especially non-technical leaders who want to understand how well their engineering teams are performing, they come up with some algorithm for understanding the relative quality and velocity of different teams. And it ends up suffering from Goodhart's law, where whatever metric you start to optimize for, it ends up just getting gamed and it stops having meaning. And something that came out of that exploration that became really obvious to me is that if you start with the assumption that you have good engineers and that your engineers want to do good work, then you don't really need to do any of those things. Trying to compare people to each other and understanding output doesn't really matter as much if you can make that assumption. And if you can't make the assumption, you probably should just solve the upstream problem, which is like hire people who you know want to do good work, who are good engineers. Does that sound like a fair statement?
I think so. There's a lot there. However, there's the alignment with cultural values, and then there's the realities of personality and emotion. And I think, as Haney put it quite aptly, not everyone is a fully actualized person who can just deal with all of the stresses of all of the most brutal realities at one time. Yes, you can make distinctions about the culture and principles and foundation that you're building and the people who you know or feel will respect and want to proliferate them. But there's still a whole bunch of variability within the people who might fit those principles.
Going back to assume good intent. So even with the developer example, you can hire people who are really good developers and who you trust have the, best interest of the company in mind. But I would imagine even within developers, there's just a range of individual velocity, right? Some people are just going to be more thinkers, are going to be better at moving faster or slower. If somebody at a, product head level is trying to figure out the velocity of the product for the company to meet milestones or to get to a certain place, accounting for that individual variance isn't about sort of treating people like adults or not. It's just the reality that people sort of behave differently. And I think on the other side, I think it's possible for maybe particularly employees early in their career or people even later in their career who have maybe come from very different organizations that had different incentive structures or different political structures that will, for completely innocent reasons, find themselves acting in ways that we would look at and say, like, well, you're not acting like an adult. So I think this speaks to your point, Sam, about you can't pick who's in your country. You can pick who's in your company. It's like, yes, with an asterisk.
Yeah. And it ties into one of your other questions. And I've been thinking about the answer and I haven't come up with one. For the sake of diversity, we don't want to bring jerks into the company just because we have an underrepresentation of jerks, right? That seems like an obvious example. So diversity for diversity's sake is not the goal. But if you end up with a group of people who all share the same characteristics across the board, that's probably bad. But there are some characteristics that you want everyone to have in common. So I don't know what the boundaries of that might be.
Having misaligned principles, if we disagree about the way we see the world, like for example, disagree in commit or transparency culture, we're going to create unnecessary and prolific friction and problems. However, like inside of an individual, you have not just the way that they think about the world, the mental models they share, but also who they are as a person and their background experiences, where they come from, what they value in life in the long term. I think you have a lot of person variety and diversity in who the person is. That's, I think, what we're talking about here is, do you want replicas of the same individual across their personality traits who might have really great communication, like they might be able to work flawlessly together, but you're not going to have a lot of out of the box thinking potentially. I don't have an answer in terms of like what we're selecting for, but I suppose we want similar shared principle, but diverse personality.
Like, the example you just mentioned, transparency, is interesting because I know one of the examples that you guys have both talked about around like disagree and commit, for instance, was Josh, your reticence around some of the transparency ideas early on when Sam suggested them. So you can imagine a world in which, let's say, Josh, you're interviewing for this job 2 years in, and this gets brought up, and you, for completely legitimate reasons of your past, just have a real challenge with that idea. And you might say in the interview, look, boy, this really doesn't resonate with me. I mean, I guess I trust you guys if you think it's a good idea. But you could imagine an internal conversation, a sort of bar raiser conversation where we go, look, man, I just don't know if Josh is a cultural fit. He's really opposed to this transparency idea. And that would remove your ability to grow into that learning.
I love Haney's example of you and I sort of disagreeing on the transparency thing initially. I think that's part of acting like an adult maybe is, I'm not trying to say I'm the model person here. I've definitely misinterpreted opinions, but just in this example, I think it is trying to find the rationale for the argument rather than just putting up a blocker.
One of the out of left field proposals that I've had that we probably won't end up implementing, but I'm going to throw it out as a straw man, which is the default functionality of every applicant tracking system at every company is as soon as you hire somebody, all of the interviews and assessments all get hidden so that that person can't see what other people thought about them. What I would propose is that on day one, we give those people all of the assessments, including the people who said no hire for certain reasons. A hypothetical would be, we hire an engineer and John says, I don't think we should hire this person because I don't think that they have enough back-end skill to do the role. It would be really useful for that new hire to know that John has this concern. They can just immediately address that in an early conversation. So this maybe ties into the earlier question of can we assume that everyone is a self-actualized adult? Maybe we can.
That particular example, right? John has that concern. What happens in that conversation and what is the sort of takeaway value for both John and the candidate coming out of that conversation?
I would expect the conversation with John will go something like, hey, I saw that you had some concerns about this. How can we make sure that you understand my abilities in this regard? Or you might even say yeah, honestly, you're totally right. I'm actually not really a back-end person. And most of my skill is focused on front end. The one thing that it really reinforces very early on is that direct negative feedback is acceptable. Whether it's worth whatever cost there is a different question. I wonder if that is a thing that makes sense in the context of treat people like adults.
I'm thinking about the notes that I'm putting in to candidates I'm interviewing now. And sometimes the notes I'm putting in are about the vibe I get, because that kind of has to be important, right? I'm going to work with this person a lot. And it could be, I don't know what the utility is of them seeing what the first impression of my vibe was on that first conversation.
Yeah, this is kind of where my mind goes. If there's a quantitative rationale, we can explicitly say this person is not good at something that they have to be good at, well, we probably won't hire them. Or it's something like, well, they're not sharp on this thing, but they're fast learners. We think they can improve. I agree with Haney that just being able to read my stream of consciousness, semi-pedantic response to an interview doesn't mean this person can't perform in their role. That information is, I think, important for the team to know from me, but I don't think it's important for the person to start on day one feeling like, well, there's this indelible part of my personality that this person just dislikes, and now I feel attacked. I don't know that it's inside of human nature to be able to completely ignore that and in a self-actualized way be like, I am like water, this is okay. I think at some point it's going to hurt.
I wonder if the compromise here is we have an onboarding card that even says something specifically like, by the way, unlike most companies, we haven't hidden all of your interviews and people's assessments. This is part of our culture is we're not going to go out of our way to hide information from you. It's kind of up to you on whether you want to look at them or not.
I think it's a question of what's the goal? Is the goal to help this person improve in their job? Because if so, I think there's a better framing than this person stumbling across their Notion document with fairly raw, unfiltered thoughts in place. It's one thing to have a list of areas for optimization or improvement from your manager saying, hey, this is the feedback that we got during the hiring process. Like, we'd like to sharpen on these 6 points. That feels very motivating, in my opinion. It's like knowing where you stand and knowing what your objectives are by the next performance review. But simply having attributed negative, responses to how you act or how you interview doesn't feel as useful. I actually think that the purpose of the information is not. It's like orthogonal, where it's not opposed, but it's not aligned. Where my goal in hiring is making sure that this person is going to raise the bar, and I want to find the cracks, and I'm going to be over the top looking for small potential threads that we should pull on. Whereas if I'm giving feedback to somebody, I want to be specific, I want to be complete, I want to have data to back it up. So I would not say something like the vibe was off, just explicitly. I wouldn't, because there's nothing to back that up. So that's why I think, again, to preserve the quote unquote sanctity of a bar raising interview process, you want people to be able to raise blockers that are just blockers. Like, hey, I don't like this thing. This is bothering me. So
yeah, that's a good point. Like the purpose is orthogonal. I see what you mean by that.
I think what we want and what we started this conversation around is that we want to lean in on negative feedback. Constructive negative feedback is a tool that we use at this company, and we need to reinforce that from day one. We need people who engage in good faith and are able to steelman the other side's feedback, even to the extent that maybe we implement something like that along the lines of when you receive negative feedback, as opposed to taking a combative, argumentative stance and trying to rationalize like, oh, well, this is why you're wrong. It's possible that maybe we implement something where your goal, your responsibility is to steelman that and actually double down.
Yeah, it relates to one of the principles in the book we're reading right now, the 15 Commitments to Conscious Leaders. And one is see everybody as an ally. And that, I think, speaks to what you're talking about, Josh. It's sort of the equivalent of steel manning. It's see every piece of feedback, whether it is intended to be positive or not. Like the example they give is maybe somebody in the company is out to get you, but you don't have to treat it like that. You can take whatever they're doing as an opportunity for you to learn, for you to grow, for you to see what the universe is giving you in that feedback.
What would be a good way of reinforcing this cultural value of treat people like adults as early as possible in the process, so that people know that we take it very seriously?
Is that about trust? Because in that case, we communicate that by saying, we trust you to improve our onboarding process. We trust you to take this corporate card and not abuse it. We trust you to take vacation when you want to. We trust you to manage your own day. Those are all signs that we treat you like an adult. If treat you like an adult means we assume that you have a level of consciousness and emotional maturity, and we're going to test that, that's a little different.
I agree with Haney. We reinforce treating you like an adult throughout the entire interview process. I think, directly handing over investor updates and all hands meetings and basically giving you the entire playbook of the company is something that I think shocks most people because they're not used to being treated like an adult in that way.